Max lifted his head and whimpered. He didn't recognize his surroundings. He sniffed the air, but the scents were all unfamiliar. He smelled only the damp, decaying leaves that kept gathering from one season to another in the hollow spaces between the rocks. It was dark, and Max instinctively knew that something was wrong. He shouldn't be here, among the rocks, shivering from the cold all alone. He should be somewhere else, in a warm house or a car, with his masters and his young companion, the playful puppy, Hildy. He wanted to stand up, but immediately the sharp pain in his front paw made him stagger. Losing balance, he fell on his flank. Dimly, he recalled a happy outing in the woods. 2 children, not the usual members of his household, but fun to be with nevertheless. His masters and Hildy walking along a cool path, he straining to be free of his leash. Then he remembered running after a swift squirrel, and then he had a feeling of flying or falling down very fast. Then nothingness. He did not know how long he had been unconscious, perhaps a couple of hours, a few days. How was a dog to tell the passage of time? He only knew that it had been a long time since he had had anything to eat or drink. He was starved and parched from thirst. He tried to move again, but the excruciating pain in his front foot caused him to yelp. Max licked his paw tentatively. It felt painful even under his soft, moist tongue. He whined again, his nerves tense, hoping to hear the soothing voices of his masters, who always responded to his calls of distress. But all that his sensitive ears could hear now were the unfamiliar sounds of the forest at night. Intuitively, Max knew that he had to wait until morning. He whimpered like a puppy and tried to make himself comfortable, but his paw kept throbbing, making it impossible for him to settle down. He kept licking it, the salty taste of his own blood mixing with that of saliva dripping freely from his red tongue. He finally fell asleep, his body trembling from cold and his senses numb from pain and the lack of food. When Max awoke some hours later, the rays of sun warmed him. He felt better, and his thoughts immediately turned to food. Oh boy, was he hungry. He yawned and stretched, and at once the severe pain in his paw made itself known to him. He cried sharply, but the echo only returned his cries of anguish. Max struggled to his feet. He knew instinctively that he had to get home. He didn't know where his home was, nor how long he had been away from it, but he knew that he had to find it. Max limped on 3 legs, sniffing the ground. He searched for familiar scents, but found none. There were plenty of smells, to be sure, the frightening, foreboding sense of wild animals that raised his hackles, but nothing familiar, comforting, or friendly. He sniffed the bushes, searching for the odor of his own urine. It's a sign that marks the boundary of an animal's territory, or possibly marks the way home. But all that he could smell was his own scent near the place where he first had regained consciousness. Max didn't know how long he had been lying among the rocks with his front foot broken, but his body aching and his empty stomach told him that it must have been a long time indeed. He hobbled around trying to find his way out of the labyrinth of boulders and underbrush. He stopped often to rest, but each time his efforts to get up and walk again became more difficult and painful. It must have been several days since Max had eaten. The only water that he could find was in a little brackish pool at the bottom of a large rock formation. Max was cold at night, shivering on the frost-covered ground. In the daytime, he was parched with the sun beating down on him, drying up all the little pools of thawed moisture that were his only sources of water. Still, Maxie dragged along, driven by his instinct for survival. He encountered a family of skunks sniffing the air about them with suspicion. Max, usually so full of curiosity, barely looked at them. He was exhausted, emaciated, and dehydrated, his tongue hanging out of his mouth and his vision playing tricks on him. He breathed shallowly, ignoring the skunks. The inquisitive animals, they scampered away, satisfied that he represented no threat. Various colorful birds fluttered around him as Max rested for longer and longer periods each time. The birds had no fear of the large black dog, whose coat, once shiny and sleek, was now covered with sores. Max grew weaker every hour. Yet, with enormous effort, he continued to search for his way back home or to some type of human habitation. He had an unshakable trust in people. Max knew that once he reached people, they would help him. He had never yet met a person who had been unkind to him. His masters, their friends, his trainer, even the veterinarians, a group of people he did not enjoy knowing, were always kind to him. If only he could find some people. His perseverance was at last rewarded. One day, a week or so after he was hurt, Max heard the familiar sounds of automobiles whizzing along the highway. Automobiles meant people, and people meant safety and food. Max barked, but no one answered. He dragged himself forward with renewed energy over the forest floor, covered with sharp, dry pine needles. Every inch of his progress was torture. His body now was nothing but skin and bones covered with bleeding sores, but he limped and he crawled, driven by his powerful instinct to live. He was not going to die so close to people, so close to help. At last he reached the highway. With the last drop of energy, he climbed the steep shoulder of the roadway and collapsed. He lay there, panting, waiting for the next upsurge of strength that would give him the energy to walk along the highway until he reached people. The cars kept passing him by, the people inside either not noticing or not caring. Max rested, drifting in and out of reality. At last, he felt that he was ready to try again. Painfully, he rose to his feet and staggered across the road. Almost at once, he was struck by a car speeding along the highway. Max reeled. He was thrown by the impact of the collision into the ditch along the road. His tongue rolled out of his mouth and his eyes shut. He did not move. "Did you hit a dog, hon?" a woman in the car asked. "I think so," replied the man. "Shouldn't we stop and see if we can help?" "Nah, it was a stray. Who cares? Hell with it. Nobody saw us." And they sped away. Maxie regained consciousness some hours later. He lay in a ditch along the road, the flies buzzing over his open sores. He felt pain all over his wasted body, but still, he tried to stand up. He had a vague recollection of his long trek toward the highway and his struggle to climb over the shoulder of the road. As Max braced himself to get up on his feet, he suddenly realized that his right leg and right hip were immobile. He looked back at his leg and saw it twisted, hanging down helplessly. The suffering dog had a broken hip and hind leg. He licked his injured leg, unable to stand up. Wise beyond his years, Max knew that he had reached the final chapter in his fight for life. He dropped his head on his outstretched paws, waiting to drift into the blessed state of semi-consciousness, where one is spared the feeling of pain, the frustration of uncertainty, and the all-enveloping fear of death, be one a human being or an animal. Still, Max did not die. Several more days must have passed before he finally ventured out of the ditch, and all around him he could smell the presence of people. From time to time he heard the shrill voices of children playing somewhere nearby, and smells of campfires and cooking drifted toward him, renewing his quest for survival. Max knew that there must be a camp nearby, and he was almost there. If only he could get close enough to people. Max felt that his life was ebbing away fast, and if he didn't reach people, he knew he had no chance to live. Max barked, but his voice was weak and no one heard him. He gathered the last remnants of his strength and, using his broken front paw, despite its excruciating pain, stood up. He hobbled on 3 legs to the other side of the highway, crossing it at night because he sensed that the danger of being hit by a car would be less at that time. Once on the other side, he hobbled up the other 2 miles that separated the camp from the road. Exhausted by his effort, he fell down again, this time within sight of the campers. But Max could move no more. Hours later, as another night was fast approaching, Max gathered enough strength and limped toward a group of children playing in front of a camper. "Look at this poor doggy," a young boy cried. "He's just skin and bones." Max tried to wag his short tail to show that he was friendly. The boy petted him, noticing Maxie's tags. "Get away from that dog," a woman yelled from the back door of a camper, throwing an empty beer can at Maxie. It hit him on his broken hip. He yelped shrilly and desperately, and limped into the bushes, collapsing near a sequoia tree. "The dog probably has rabies and he may be dangerous," the woman continued to yell, ordering the children into the camper. "Now what's all this ruckus about?" A fat, sleepy man appeared at the door of another camper, rubbing his eyes with the back of his fists. "Where's this mad dog?" "Right there in the bushes," the woman replied, pointing to the spot where Maxie had disappeared into the thicket. "I'll get him," the man exclaimed, his sleepiness all but gone as he dashed into the camper for his shotgun. In a moment, he reappeared, his loose suspenders now firmly pulled over his shoulders and crisscrossing his back, his huge belly dancing inside his dirty, baggy trousers. "We don't want no mad dogs around these here premises," he muttered angrily as he emptied his shotgun into a cluster of the underbrush. "I wish I could see where the hell he is, this mad dog." He reloaded his gun and shot into the bushes again. "He was right there, you probably got him," the woman chattered shrilly. "Right there in the bushes. Ain't it something, a mad dog in the park? They ought to do something about it. It ain't right to have mad dogs running around a public park." The children crowded at the doors of both campers, afraid to come out, yet fascinated and burning with the desire to examine the dead mad dog. But it was too dark, and they knew that they had to wait until morning. "Did you touch him?" a girl asked the boy who had seen Max's first, her eyes round with excitement. "Sure," the boy said. "I petted his head." "Did he bite you?" "Of course not. He was friendly," objected the boy. "I know that he belonged to somebody. He had a red collar on with tags. His name is Max. It was on his tag." "I say he was dangerous," insisted the woman. "I've never seen a scurvier-looking dog in my life." "He was probably abandoned by his owners because he was mad. He looked vicious. All Dobermans are vicious. I would never trust a Doberman. They turn on their masters. I saw a movie once where a Doberman turned on his owner and tore him to pieces." She kept rattling on as the children listened, their eyes wide with wonder of their miraculous escape from the jaws of a mad dog. Max heard the blast of a shotgun, and a shudder ran through his emaciated and exhausted body. He was too weak to crawl away, so he stayed where he was, behind the huge 100-year-old sequoia stump, as if knowing that it offered him the best protection. Then, the second blast shattered the silence of the forest. He heard people's voices, but they sounded loud and unfriendly. Max knew that the people in the campers were his enemies. He knew, now, that it was dangerous for him to remain in their vicinity, yet he stayed, for he recalled one person, a child, who had been kind to him. Something made him want to see this person again. The child reminded Max of the boys who had been with his masters a long time ago, driving in a car with his friend Hildy. Maxie wasn't sure when it all had happened, but he had the dim recollection of a feeling of peace and contentment. This child who petted him reminded him of those happy times. It was another very cold night in the woods, and the ground began to stiffen under a thin layer of frost. Max licked the frosty crust, and it made him feel a little bit better by moistening his parched mouth. He waited until it was completely dark, and he could hear no sounds from the campers. He knew now why he remained so close to the unfriendly people. It wasn't only the boy. Wherever there were people, there was food. An unfinished hamburger, half a cookie, a chicken bone, always something. His instinct urged him to scavenge around the campers. Max pulled himself up. Painfully, he limped back close to the campers. He sniffed at 2 garbage cans, but could not lift their lids, and he was too weak to turn the cans over. Suddenly, Maxie must have realized that he had no more strength, and for the first time since he had fallen off the cliff, he became completely apathetic. During the night, he crawled as far away from the campers as he could. Sick and hurt as he was, Max still knew when he wasn't wanted. When the first rays of the warm sun on the ground began to thaw, Maxie opened up his eyes and shut them at once. The sun was too bright for his inflamed, dry eyes, yet he thought that he saw something that he was searching for so desperately. Right in front of him were several rough-hewn cabins and cleanly swept sidewalks. He sniffed the air, and again smelled people. Different people. People in houses, like home. There was no scent of oil and gasoline, which he had smelled at the trailer camp. Then he tensed. His experience of the previous night taught him that not all people were his friends. Max was wary now. He waited, listening for harsh, unfriendly voices. But there were none. He saw people move in and out of the cabins, and he called out to them, but his voice must have become so weak that no one could hear him. He tried to pull himself up and crawl closer to the cabins, but no strength remained in his body. The day passed slowly for the suffering dog. Max drifted in and out of consciousness, barely aware of the passage of time. Another cold, brilliant night slowly descended upon the mountains and the giant trees. Max was dying. As the full moon finally ascended, bathing the woods in the nearby cabin in its soft light, cool, soft light, Max became aware of still another danger. His keen ears picked up the sound of a pack of coyotes. Normally, Max would have answered their call with his own threatening bark, but now he just whimpered, hoping instinctively that the wild creatures would stalk some other prey. Still, the howls kept coming closer as the coyotes followed Maxie's scent. They knew that their prey was injured and followed the smell of blood dripping from Maxie's injured feet. They were brazen creatures, often boldly scavenging near human habitats, unafraid of anything but the loud discharge of a gunshot. They came to the clearing before the cabins, 5 of them, ghostly apparitions in the silvery moonlight. Their tails were bushy, almost like foxes' tails, not yet having shed their long winter hair. Their eyes reflected the moon, gleaming phosphorescently and menacingly. They circled the dying dog slowly, not ready yet to attack, but narrowing the orbit of their approach, boldly ignoring the presence of human habitation. Max bared his teeth and growled, but only a rattling sound came out of his weakened throat. The coyotes knew that they had an easy prey. It could be theirs whenever they wished. They howled again, one after another, and then they pounced on Max, yelping like young dogs with excitement. "Damn it, I'm gonna get them once and for all," a man swore inside one of the cabins. He switched on the electricity and powerful lights flooded the clearing before the cabins. The sudden brightness frightened the coyotes and they scampered in all directions. Max wanted to bark, to let the man know that he was near and that he needed help, but no sound came from his dry throat. He lay, panting shallowly, unable to lift his head. The man left the floodlights on throughout the night, and the coyotes dared not return. In the morning, the warm sun somewhat revived Maxie once more. He opened his eyes and saw the cabins so near. If only he could crawl a little closer. He heard light footsteps on a path leading from the parking area. A young girl, dressed in blue jeans and a Mexican blouse, slowly walked along the path with an armload of bed linen, whistling as she went. She had a friendly, freckled face, framed by long brown hair. Maxie could smell the fresh scent of her soap, and it reminded him of home. He whimpered, and the girl stopped. "Oh, you poor, miserable creatures," he said, softly placing the linen on a wooden bench and bending over Maxie. "What happened to you, boy? Are you hurt?" Maxie tried to lift his head and nuzzled her hand. He was too weak to lick her hand properly. Poor baby," the girl crooned. "You're starved." She looked at Maxie's tags and read aloud, "Max. If lost, please notify Dr. and Mrs. George Wayne. Reward." Then followed our telephone number. "You poor boy," she said. "You must have been out there. You must have been lost. Stay here. I'll bring you something to eat." She picked up her linen and ran toward the office. Max did not want to let her out of his sight. It was the first time in 3 weeks that he had heard the sound of a friendly human voice. Sick and almost dead as he was, he still recognized the familiar words, "stay," and "eat." He managed to utter one hoarse bark to let her know that he appreciated her concern, but he didn't want her to leave him. He strained, trying to get up, and found that he had no muscles left to help him lift his body. He was weaker than a blind puppy. He whimpered, pitifully, watching the back of the disappearing girl. She turned around quickly, and her heart went all out to the suffering dog. "Don't worry, Max," she said, calling him by his name. "I promise, I'll be back." The sound of his own name quieted Maxie, and somehow he trusted her, and he knew that she would return.